You are listening to Demystifying Organizations. In partnership with McGraw-Hill Education, I'm your host, Jeff Shatton. My guest today is Sandra Sucher. She is a professor of management practice at the Harvard Business School. Sucher is the author of over 100 business cases, technical notes, video interviews, and teaching notes on leadership and ethical dilemmas of businesses and their managers. And she's the author of 2 books, The Moral Leader, Challenges, Insights, and Tools, and Teaching the Moral Leader, a literature-based leadership course, a guide for instructors. I'd like to welcome to the podcast Sandra Sucher. Thanks so much for joining me.
Oh, you're welcome. My pleasure.
So you have a very interesting article recently featured in Harvard Business Review about trust and the nature of trust in corporate America today. Can you go ahead and give an overview of your thinking on the relationship between business and society in terms of trust?
Sure. So I think let me just start by defining trust.
Okay.
Because that's always helpful when you get started. So trust is our willingness to make ourselves vulnerable to the good intentions and behavior of someone else or a company. So when we trust someone, we give them power over us on the assumption that they're not going to betray the trust or use the power that they have over us for bad purposes. So it is very much a power relationship, and it goes 2 ways, but meaning that we're always evaluating the companies and the individuals who we trust. But it definitely is a giving over of some part of your life and saying that I trust you to do something quite specific for me, and I'm going to trust you to do that. So, what we found in our research into best practices of companies that are really good at earning trust is that they're good at a number of things. The first thing that they have to be good at is they just have to be competent. So it's really hard to be trusted if you're not a competent business, but it helps us understand companies like Uber, who we love to hate. With Uber, we trust them to get us from. Oh, hold on, I just have to kill this. Okay.
I'll edit it out. Don't worry about it.
Okay. With Uber, we trust them very much to get us from point A to point B. But there are a whole lot of things that we don't trust them for with relation to how they treat their employees, with relation to their kind of dodgy practices for getting established in a city and for growing. And so Uber is a good example because we can trust companies on some dimensions, but not on all dimensions. And trust is actually a quite specific thing. I trust you.
Yeah. So let's drill down. Let's drill down on Uber because I think it's such an amazing case. So we love Uber because it's quick, it's fast, it's efficient. It does exactly what we want. The headlines for Uber are ridiculous. From things like the Godview incident, where they were tracking one-night stands in New York City of celebrities and then talking about it, to flagrant violations of any city ordinance, to treatment of employees. And yet, Uber has scaled unlike anything else, right? It has scaled like the worst weed in your garden. So how do you make sense of their ethical practices in light of their resounding success, at least in terms of revenue, in the marketplace?
Well, so you can make revenue all different kinds of ways, right? And the fact that you're successful doesn't mean you're good, also doesn't mean you're bad. But Uber is a particularly bad actor, and really is an example of this split that we can have between a company whose service we can trust, but a company who we don't trust. And so for most people think of trust as kind of an all or nothing proposition, but it's actually quite specific. I trust you to do a certain thing for me. And I trust that you'll do that because it's important to me and all of that. I don't trust you for a whole lot of other things necessarily. And so I think that's, for some people, kind of a surprise. Trust always seems like this global notion that I either trust you or I don't. And that's not true. It's quite specific. And Uber is a really, really good example of that.
Right. So you would say in your writing, right, that Uber would get an A+ in their technical competence, yep, but maybe not in their social competence.
Exactly. Yeah. And we found that was a useful way to split out competence, that there's the sort of nuts and bolts of simply being good at the business you're in. And that's what we're calling your technical competence. And then there's how you manage all of the relationships that come with being a business. And that includes kind of reading the room, understanding your regulatory environment, where your markets are headed, all of that. And Uber actually is not, they're thoughtful about those things, but kind of thoughtful only in the sense of being instrumental in how they can take advantage of what they see as openings.
But what's the consequence for Uber's low social competence?
So Uber's growth has slowed. Its IPO was profoundly disappointing, and Lyft is gaining market share. So, I think that there definitely is a sense of people, given an alternative to Uber, I'll go for that alternative. I know. All
right.
Yeah, go on.
I'm gonna provide just a little pushback on some of this. Yeah. So just as from my assessment of Uber, right? Uber's stock has struggled, which is in my assessment much more about the mechanics of the industry that they're in, which is it's a hyper competitive industry where price is being driven into the ground, and Uber has decided in order to scale that they will subsidize fares. So they will take a loss on every fare in order to gain market share. Mm-hmm. And so their costs are astronomical because they're running their prices into the ground in order to try and become a monopoly, which is a whole other host of issues. But if you look at their revenue growth, which in my mind is a really good indicator over the last, if we just never mind a quarterly basis, but if you look at it over the last 7 years, it looks like a hockey stick. And Uber has pretty successfully, taken over the world in terms of ride sharing, now to the point where, they are in competition with Lyft. And so my concern is actually that they have succeeded in spite of the fact that they have really low social competence.
Right. Yeah. And, I think that certainly for a company like Uber, it sort of, if you look at the trend line, it's definitely hockey stick shaped. But if you look at its most recent financial performance, and it's losing a ton of money because of this strategy that it's following, and its stock offering was not well received. So I think that whereas before Uber was kind of a success story that even if you hated them, there were just sort of no signs that they were being harmed. I think that there's a complex story here about what happens when people get sort of fed up with something, and once they're offered an alternative, Uber used to own the market, and Lyft has definitely been increasing its market share at Uber's expense. So I think that that's a trend that's worth watching to see kind of, is there an upper limit to how far Lyft can go and all of that. But I think that, we shouldn't just judge companies' success based on their financials sort of in one direction or the other. I think it's great that they can be successful and obviously important to their survival and competitiveness. But I think that we count on companies to do more. And that's why we don't like Uber. because we feel like the things that it does in the name of making money really aren't very good.
Yeah, no, I mean, and I agree. I agree completely. My concern is that Uber becomes an example of success in the model of, I think it's Facebook's terms of, break things, whatever. I'm messing it up, but the break things model, and then push regulations and ask questions later, and that if someone was looking at Uber and saying, if they wanted to do a startup that was going to push, let's say, local laws, they would look at Uber as a model and say, yeah, we're just going to flagrantly violate local laws and then figure out with our lawyers on the back end.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that if you study something like trust and the benefits that come from it, you understand that companies can make decisions that can be very helpful to them in the short run that have nothing to do with building a reputation for being a trusted deliverer of a service or a product. But companies have always had those choices. There's the sort of the high road, the middle road, the low road.
Right.
And so I think just because we'd like it to be different doesn't mean that you can't always find some company that cuts corners and go, well, hell, I'm going to do that too. Yeah.
So maybe let's shift to another company that has dealt with major trust issues, who I don't think has necessarily had the same success in the aftermath as Uber, which would be someone like Boeing. Can you walk us through kind of the Boeing incident and maybe how you evaluate that one?
Yeah, Boeing, you're right, is a different kind of situation. I mean, it starts with the nature of the harm that Boeing created. So it has two planes, one in Indonesia, one in Ethiopia. They crash, killing 346 people, a combination of all crew, all passengers. This is over a period of 5 months. And 40 countries by the second crash had declared that they were no longer going to fly these planes. And Boeing basically had to be told by the President of the United States that they were no longer allowed to fly. So, one of the bases on which we all evaluate whether a company is trustworthy is what are their motives? Why are they doing what they do? And it's completely incredible to think that in the face of 2 crashes of a revision of a plane model that was only 2 years out, that they would allow themselves to keep trying to argue that the plane was safe to fly. And then since then, Boeing has done a truly awful job of avoiding being a detailed recounter of what it is that they did wrong. So one of the ways that companies recover from a trust problem is that if it's a problem of competence, they simply come out and they say, here are the things that we understand that we've done wrong. And that's quite reassuring to those of us who care about a company's product or service, because we feel, well, okay, good. We've got a fighting chance here because they know they did something wrong. They can tell me in detail what it is. And so I've got some confidence that they're actually going to really do the things they say they're going to do and fix it.
Right. So it's really hard if a company doesn't own up to what they've done. It's very difficult as a consumer or as an employee or as a regulator to ever believe that they're going to make good.
That's true, although there is some interesting empirical research that says that for competence based problems that you should always apologize in just the way I said.
Mm-hmm.
But if you have a sort of an ethical problem, a question of your integrity, they found, the researchers who looked into this, that actually apologizing for that doesn't do you much good, because people have a funny attitude toward ethical problems. They feel if you did it once, you can do it many times. And so they really just don't trust someone. And so they say the only way to, at least if you didn't do the thing that you're being accused of, is to keep repeating that you didn't do it.
It's interesting. So I kind of think of the difference between the Tylenol scare in the early 80s, where some lunatic put but was before my real awareness at my age. But some lunatic put poison in the Tylenol in stores. That versus the Wells Fargo scandal, which was one much more of the company ethics, where the company itself was self-dealing and creating false accounts. So how much you think through those two, if I'm getting those right in terms of that they might be two different crises?
I think they definitely are. And I think you've done a good job of separating out. It's a competence-based issue from the Tylenol standpoint, only in that they had the bad luck to have the pills that cyanide was put into. But they were pretty able to convince people that they didn't do that themselves. And within 6 weeks, they had put new packaging with their capsule pills back on the market. So even though they didn't cause the problem, they worked unbelievably hard with the industry to come up with what they called tamper-evident packaging. Wells Fargo, on the other hand, was simply a case of a company deciding to make money in a really, really unethical way. So that's, and they can deny that all they want, but, it was a horrible example of how within a company you can impose certain kinds of culture and values and incentives that will create a kind of a pocket of malpractice.
So are you suggesting that the dominant strategy for Tylenol, because it's a technical one, is own what happened and then figure out a solution and then sell the solution, which they did, and then for Wells Fargo, would it be to deny the ethical lapse?
No,
in terms of the research, I don't mean in terms of your advice, but in terms of the research, are you suggesting that not that you would say Wells Fargo deny it, but that the strategy that works the best is to deny it?
No.
Okay.
And if I've given that impression,
okay.
I can picture a couple of guys that are going to be very angry at me. And so, no, what the research says is if you are guilty of the thing that you've been accused of doing, the worst thing you can do is deny it. And so, which is ironically what most companies do when faced with some kind of a problem, regardless of the source. And so the advice about denying it is only if you're innocent of the thing that people think.
Got it. I think I missed that. Okay.
It's a really important distinction. I'm glad you brought that up.
Okay. So then Wells Fargo should accept responsibility because it's clearly guilty, has been well established. So accept responsibility and then what?
Well,
to rebuild trust.
Yeah. So I think at that point, I worked in business for 20 years before I came to HBS as a faculty member. And you basically have to start from ground zero and do, the world's best and most objective analysis of all of the sources that led to that behavior being regarded as okay. And so, that's a top-down scrutiny with outsiders probably involved as well as insiders. It's an attempt to build trust inside the unit that did those things so people will tell you actually what was going on. And you really have to understand and take accountability for what it was that you did or allowed to happen that made that behavior seem to be the thing to do. And so, that's true of all corporate problems. This is the problem of wrongdoing, but it would be true if you had a really big problem in your factory. I mean, the first thing you would do is just a really thorough, objective analysis of exactly how that came to pass. And that then, leads you to some actions about people who probably don't belong there because they were instrumental in creating that culture and the practices that supported it. And also trying to figure out how you can reclaim and retrain people into habits of morality and that you want the company to stand for. So,
can you think of an example of a company that's had an ethical lapse and had a successful transition from being really down in the dirt to making it on the up and up?
So there's a company in Japan called Recruit Holdings, which is at $20 billion in revenues, the largest tech company in Japan. It basically is a platform matching company that allows you to buy houses, education, travel through various platforms that connect sellers and users, as well as having a big business on recruiting. And they had a scandal that was so large in the late 1980s that the Prime Minister of Japan and his entire cabinet had to resign. It was a shares for favors kind of scandal that was put into place by the CEO at the time and founder. And so the company still tells the story of what they learned through the process of trying to fix the company after that. It's on their website. You can find it. And they describe what happened. They described all the actions they took to try to understand how this happened. In this case, they were fortunate and different from Wells Fargo in that it really was the actions of a single man, the founder, that was the core of the problem. But nonetheless, they had to face all the same issues of how can we rebuild trust with our customers? How can we create a good name for ourselves again? And if you go to Japan and you say recruit, the first thing they'll go is they'll sort of nod and they'll say, "Oh, the scandal."
Huh.
So, but they are a highly successful, really well managed, very interesting managed company. So one of the examples so they believe in trying to do good things with the capacities that they have. And a question that you would get asked if you worked at Recruit pretty much at any time by pretty much anyone would be, "Why are you here?" And
what's the function of that question?
And the purpose of that question is to help people try to discover what thing they think they want to do to make the world a better place, and to do that at Recruit. And so they're always pushing people to connect their personal passions, the things they're motivated by, with the company. And they give lots of autonomy to very junior people to try to set up businesses that they think have a chance of being successful, like offering tutoring for rural students in Japan to help them get into college at a very low price. And so,
so they're basically broadening the social contract between business and society.
Exactly. They are saying that is the contract. And what is it that we can do in our way to try to make that society a more flourishing and better place?
So in the United States and elsewhere as well, we've seen a lot of consolidation of power and influence in terms of especially our major tech companies. How has that consolidation of power impacted trust violations?
Well, first, it simply gives the company more power and more scope to do mistrustworthy things. So Facebook is obviously the poster child for this with respect to its actions in many situations, but in particular in the 2016 presidential election. Its refusal to take responsibility for messages and uses of Facebook's platform meant that Russian operatives were able to establish a whole raft of false apps of different kinds to reach people through social media to try to persuade them to the Trump cause. And what's worse, they gave access of 87 of its million of its users to Cambridge Analytica to use to profile them to see how they can be persuaded to vote for Donald Trump. So, that's what power looks like.
How much of the Facebook issue do you attribute to the following? Maybe it was a process of groupthink where if I were to give a beneficial take from their perspective, it'd be maybe as follows. They suffered from groupthink, from the ideology that it was a platform in the same way that we think of a fork or we think of a typewriter, right? Where you wouldn't blame a typewriter for the writing of Mein Kampf. And that they believed that they were a neutral platform that was just a vehicle for anyone to use, and only later recognized the harm that it caused.
So I think that is a plausible explanation, but I think it's a very generous one. 2016 was pretty late in the game for Facebook to understand the power that it had. And people had been talking about it for years before then, that they had to come up with some better ways to protect its users from vile content that would incite violence and hate crimes. So, I think you're allowed to kind of have groupthink, but only for a certain period of time. And then one of the really true, most important dimensions on which companies are trusted is whether they take accountability and responsibility for all the impacts they have, not just the ones they intend.
Yeah. I'm gonna kind of jump on the other side right now. Right. So Facebook was so well aware of their impact that they already had massive content analyzers who were hired full time to take care of hate speech and take care of all kinds of vile things on their platform that they were already getting rid of many years before the 2016 election. So it's not like on a whole host of other issues, they were already not just a platform. If we go back to the typewriter analogy, right? So you sell a typewriter, you sell just a basic laptop. The company literally does not know what you are typing. They do not know what you're writing. They do not have any idea. And that's simply not the case with Facebook.
Yeah.
And they were already taking action at scale on a whole host of issues. There are just a few that they weren't touching, which seem to be the ones surrounding elections.
Yeah, I don't know I don't have any access to the empirical view of that as to what stuff Facebook was taking care of and what they were ignoring.
Largely like nudity, pornography, hate, like vile hate speech. It's why 8chan is 8chan and Facebook is relatively clean.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, I think that it doesn't take, a whole lot of imagination to think about yourself. And they also had a situation a couple of years later in India to understand that your platform would be used for political purposes. Yeah.
Let's look at the difference between, first let's take a look at Pinterest. So you write about Pinterest as a model. So lay out kind of your arguments for Pinterest.
Well, Pinterest does the things that you just described that Facebook does, but they seem to be a hell of a lot, better at it. So they have set up a set of community standards for the kind of content that they will not allow on their site. They train every 6 months people to be cleansing the site and set new standards for what's coming up. And they act in pretty quick ways. So when they were being used by some people to try to promote the argument to avoid having your children vaccinated, they simply removed any content related to that from their site. And they also did the same thing with some false claims that were made about some products that were supposed to help cure cancer. So, now they only, quote unquote, have 250 million users, not the scale of Facebook. But, I think that's an example of consistency and of direct action that Facebook may, to your point, be doing some of, but not in the way that they could have predicted, one would argue, that they would be used.
So let's contrast Pinterest though with Twitter, right? So Pinterest is able to, let's just use the example of vaccines to say, look, on our site, we're not going to allow you to peddle misinformation about vaccines. Twitter doesn't necessarily have that luxury in that Twitter, the whole purpose of Twitter's existence is the marketplace of ideas. And so they naturally are going to have a higher threshold for free speech violation in terms of taking people down or taking down content. They do. I'm drawing a blank on the guy's name. That racist file character who was thrown off of Twitter recently. You have Milonopolis who was thrown off. So they will throw people off if they violate their hate speech rules, but they don't have the same filter that a place like Pinterest is going to. But this is because Twitter's very reason for existence is the marketplace of ideas.
Right. And, but I think that saying that is your business strategy doesn't get you off the hook from making a judgment about whose ideas and what ideas. And, I understand that it would mean that you would have a higher bar for what you allow to go on, but that's not the same thing as saying that there's no bar, or that there's a bar that you couldn't invoke more often than you might be doing it. So, what we know now is that all of these platforms have the capacity to galvanize social action in real time. And they influence the things that people think about and talk about around the world. And so we can't pretend that doesn't exist, or, hide behind, I'm not suggesting you're saying this, our company mission, and ignore the impact that we're having on the world. I just don't think that there's any way to understand what it means to be a decent business and to take that kind of a, well, that's just the business I'm in stance. And I'm not even saying that they do that exclusively, but could they do more? Sure, they could do more. And so that's what I think.
Yeah, so I've seen a bunch of interviews with Jack Dorsey and the CEO or founder of Twitter, and I'm relatively sympathetic to the challenge that he faces in terms of what is acceptable in the marketplace. So let's say it's the anti-vaccine movement. So should they have a place to state whatever they want on this business platform that we call Twitter?
Well, why?
I'm saying I don't have an answer. I don't have an answer to where you draw that line. I'm sympathetic to not know. I cannot tell you whether I don't have a good idea as to whether on a place like Twitter, the anti-vaccine folks should have a microphone.
Right. So, but guess what, Jeff? All that says is that it's a good thing that you're not the CEO.
Well, I'm saying where would you draw the line?
Well, I think that the line is it's not that hard. I think you look at the nature of the harm that you could create, the severity of the harm you could create, the scope of the harm that you could create, and you ask some, kind of common sense predictive questions about what is it that will happen if this runs. And
yeah, I think you end up in some really challenging territory very quickly.
I'm not denying that it's not, but that's the business you chose to be in. And you can't pretend to be in that business and ignore those issues. And of course they're hard, but there have been hard questions at all kinds of businesses, pharma businesses. How much pollution are you going to try to stop? If you're a tire manufacturer like Michelin, everybody has challenges that border on the ethical. And so, I think that's just the nature of the challenges of that business. I'm not saying it's easy, but it doesn't mean it can't be thought about, and they could have a position that they could actually then take to some people, publicize it, and see what happens then.
So I can say, at least for Twitter, which I'm much more familiar with in terms of their inner processes, they have very well thought out methods for throwing people off the system.
That's good.
I think they probably set the bar at a different place than you or I might want them to set it, but it's clearly a well thought out system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's good. I think the second test I would ask them to apply is what are the effects of the things that they let through.
Right.
So unless there's some kind of a feedback loop that they're interested in, of we let this thing go because it matches our bar, and then what happened, if anything, and good news, nothing happens. Not so good news, so we can track it back to some things that did happen. I think it's up to them to find out whether these well thought out systems actually are having the effect they think they are.
I want to turn our attention to consumers. What's the role of the consumer in terms of corporate breaches of trust?
Well, consumers can play a very important role in just these domains that we're talking about. So the @delete Uber hashtag, got about 200,000 people, which is for them a sort of drop in the bucket, to just cancel their Uber accounts. And there's a very interesting process that's going on now of what would I call it? It's kind of a process of social activism from parties that have less power than others. So I think that this is true. You see it with employees at Google protesting Project Maven and not wanting to be part of making a drone that would be better able to target someone than something else. And they basically said that's not the use to AI that we want to sign on for. So I think that there's an attempt, and consumers are part of it, employees increasingly in tech are part of it, to try to fight back and to try to be part of the process of setting some of these standards that you and I are debating. And I think that that's a remarkably healthy and interesting development to see that kind of collective action being taken by groups that normally would be fairly passive because, companies are not democracies and they're not used to taking a lot of guidance from people below. And Google, to its credit, has done a pretty good job of opening up the space for people to debate things like that, to explain why they thought it was a good idea, and eventually to back down. And so I think that that's a good example of what it means to be able to be responsive, whether it's customer pressure or employee pressure. I think both of those are increasingly becoming important, and investors are becoming in their own way a source of pressure around not wanting at least the risk that comes with companies that end up with scandals.
Yeah, the Google example was heartening for me to see employees stand up against a practice that they disagree with. Yeah. For a $1 trillion market cap company, for employees to be able to stand up and say that we don't want to take part in something that's for war, and then to have that succeed is rather remarkable.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what do you think is the role? What is the role of governance in the federal government in these issues?
Well, I think we will find out. So far, this has been a kind of I'll use a tired analogy, a Wild West process with truly minimal regulation. And, government, certainly in the political context with respect to the candidates for president, are all talking, as are many members of Congress, about various ideas for how to begin to get some social control over the influence of these tech companies. And, I think that they're at a scale now where that's completely appropriate. And so
the tech companies themselves are now asking for regulation.
Yeah, they are. Although, Facebook is a really interesting example. Mark Zuckerberg, famously said that he can't wait to be regulated. Yeah. And on the other hand, the New York Times reports that he's doing his hardest to try to get eMessenger and Instagram and WhatsApp so tightly entwined that if anyone came after them with antitrust ambitions, they would have a hard time breaking up the company. So I'm not sure how much credit to give Mark for doing that, although I'm sure that he would love to see some collaboration on these questions of line drawing that you and I've been talking about. Those are very tough issues, and introducing some kind of a civil voice into that's outside the business realm, I think would be very healthy.
So part of it is about, from my understanding, is regulation capture, where if these companies can play a role in the regulations that are written, they can be the only companies that are at scale and large enough to deal with the regulation. So it can be so costly. It can be so costly and cost prohibitive to deal with a major federal regulation that a $10 million or $1 billion company simply cannot compete with the Facebook in light of really strict regulation.
The same argument was used about Sarbanes-Oxley after the Enron scandal and WorldCom and that whole early 2000 era of business wrongdoing. And there were definitely expenses to complying with some of the improved scrutiny of the design of the various governance structures that were inside boards and their committees. And there's been debate afterwards as to how much of an effect they had. But there's always going to be a cost to regulation. And I think that the fact that it will cost something doesn't mean it shouldn't be done.
Right.
And so I think that, that's not an argument that I would say is a great argument for not trying to find.
No, I still think we should do it. I'm just aware that there is a reason. I'm very skeptical of Mark Zuckerberg, and there's a reason why he advocates for some regulation.
Right. No, I understand what you're saying. And because if he feels that he's in a better position to withstand the rigors of the regulation than his competitors, then it's just more competitive juice for his business. And I could imagine that to be true. But regardless of whether Facebook will or won't benefit, I think that some attempt, certainly as the Europeans have done, to try to weigh in on questions of, data privacy and who owns data and what should be disclosed about it and what do companies have the right to and what do consumers have the right to. I mean, those are very fundamental questions that, the Europeans have taken a stand on. And many other countries are now following their regulations. Again, the effect of those is not particularly clear, although they did just fine earlier this year Google for $44 million, which to them is not that much money, for violating some of these privacy requirements that are set up now in the European rules. So,
right. So they have I think the one that comes to mind that mostly affects Google is the right to be forgotten. So Europe passed a rule that you have the right to not be permanently remembered on the internet, and Google has to change its code so that people, when they request it, can be taken off of Google searches.
Right, and that's a very good example of what government can do when it's operating really well, which is to get to the sort of most important issues that affect people's lives and to try to do something about them, hopefully in concert with business, but if not, trying to influence business to a better outcome.
All right, I want to be respectful of your time. I just want to have one more question. So, given your years and years and years of study of corporate trust and violation of trust, what's your current stance on corporate behavior more broadly, and how do you see trust changing as we move forward?
So, I think that there are a whole series of trends at the sort of macro societal level that are going to require companies and all institutions to get better at trust. So from a company standpoint, I mean, we've already been talking about one, which is just the role of technology in society. And so, those are trust-related issues of privacy, of separation of what the individual owns, what the company owns. And I think that that's a domain on which we'll have to be able to do more than we've been doing. I think that there's also a move to, of anti-globalization and anti-capitalism based on the unequal distribution that our form of capitalism has created. And I think that that's a trend that has really destabilized trust in what had been a fairly stable belief in the usefulness of global exchange and of capitalist systems. And so I think that trust there is going to have to be regained. And the last and biggest area is just the planet. And, the urgency with which we now understand we need to fight climate change and global warming. And so that's going to require trust, across public, private, all of that. So, it's always been with us before as kind of a business question, but these things go well beyond business to the implications of how our society runs, and even whether we'll kind of make it across to some safer place as far as global warming and the status of the planet. So the reason I study trust is I think it's so important to being able to solve these kinds of issues, as well as the ones that we've been talking about.
Yeah, it's amazing how much trust pervades pretty much every avenue between the relationship between business and society.
Yep.
Yeah, it's you do fascinating work, and I really appreciate you coming on to the podcast.
Okay, thanks so very much, Jeff. I enjoyed it.
Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks for listening to the podcast today. If you have any questions or comments, you can email me at jeffshatten1@gmail.com. You can tweet me at jeffshatten. If you like this podcast, press the subscribe button and make sure to rate it on iTunes so that other people can find it.